In the early 1590s, Kerry seemed to be enjoying a period of relative peace, one that stood in contrast with previous years and what was coming. Indeed, looking at Kerry in 1590, it could be assumed that Elizabeth's hold over Munster was now assured, and that a new English order was being built. However, as was often the case in 16th century Ireland, events would change rapidly. Within a few years, the Munster Plantation would be overthrown, English armies defeated, and English control of Ireland threatened more than it ever had been before. The 9 Years' War was coming. Like all of Ireland, Kerry would be transformed by it. Elizabeth's rule in Munster had been tumultuous. The most powerful lord in South Munster, the Earl of Desmond, had twice broken out in rebellion, though perhaps it might be more accurate to say he had been goaded into rebellion. Ultimately, his rebellions were defeated, and the Earl himself was hunted down and killed. Worse, the title of Earl of Desmond and his lands were forfeit to the crown. His lands were to be planted. In the plantation of Munster, several thousand English settlers came to live in former Desmond lands in Cork, Limerick and Kerry. The peace that resulted from the Earl's downfall had been hard won. It was achieved by brutal campaigning and often near genocidal policies, which had resulted in the slaughter of numerous Gaelic Irish and the starvation of thousands of others. Although the 1588 Spanish Armada and the shipwrecking of thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers along the west coast of Ireland had given the government a fright, this had also been dealt with brutally and swiftly. Most of the Spaniards washed up in Ireland were slaughtered. Before starting the history of the 9 Years' War in Kerry, it's important to outline a few ideas to put the war in its context. First, at this stage, Kerry meant North Kerry and Dingle. This part of the county was held by the Earl of Desmond, the two Geraldine lords, the Knight of Kerry and Lord Fitzmaurice, O'Connor Kerry, the sole important Gaelic lord in the county, and various smaller families. South Kerry was part of the Lordship of Desmond, held by McCarthy Moore. This consisted of Iveragh, Beara and other parts of West Cork. Most of Killarney was held by McCarthy Moore, with the Lawn and Main rivers marking a rough boundary between Desmond and the rest of Kerry. Killorglin was a frontier town, changing hands a lot. In Kerry itself, Castle Island, Tralee, Ardfert, Carrigafoyle, Lishnall, Listowel and Dingle were probably the major towns or urban areas. Castlemaine was also important, since it was one of the main gateways to the Dingle Peninsula. Castle Island had been one of the seats of the Earls of Desmond, who had built a large castle there. However, it had largely been destroyed at the end of the Second Desmond Rebellion. It had then been granted to William Herbert, who had rebuilt part of the castle, though this would not survive the coming war. Second, Ireland was a country of lords and lordships. Although the role of lords has been little examined in early modern Irish history, they played an essential role in a society that was very hierarchical, in both Gaelic and English areas. In a way, lords were seen as the natural leaders of society. Outside the Pale and the various towns and cities of Ireland, the country was divided into lordships. These were held by Gaelic, Gaelicised, such as the Burkes, and Old English lords. Most had a great deal of autonomy from the government, though there were various levels of lordship. It was a complex system and one that changed constantly. We are fortunate in having a detailed knowledge of landholding and lordship in South Kerry, thanks to the survey carried out after the death of Donald McCarthy Moore, who was also Earl of Clancarty, in 1596. At the bottom were local lords such as McCrowans. These were an O'Sullivan sept who held land outside what is now Portmagee, or the Slick Cormac McCarthys who came from Dungilla, near Killorglin, but also held land on Valentia. Above them would have been regional lords, such as O'Sullivan Moore, who held much of Iveragh. He was based in Dunkerrin, a few kilometres outside Kenmare. Above them were the provincial lords, such as O'Neill or McCarthy Moore. As mentioned, McCarthy Moore was the overlord of South Kerry and much of Cork. He held a number of strong castles in Iveragh, notably Ballycarbery Palace and others in the Killarney region. Muckross Abbey was founded by one of the McCarthy Moors, and many of them were buried there. An important point about Irish lordship was that in a hierarchy of lordships, lords would almost always seek as much autonomy as they could get. Often this would involve a local or regional lord seeking the aid of the state as a counterbalance to the power of their immediate overlords or rivals. This was the case with the O'Donnells and O'Neills for centuries, and also took place within many septs. Elizabeth made such a mess of Ireland that under the power of Hugh O'Neill, many of these rivalries were overcome in the 1590s and an unprecedented confederacy of Gaelic lords founded. Gaelic succession rights differed radically from the English, especially in relation to primogeniture. Unlike the English system, the oldest son did not inherit everything. Indeed, succession did not even have to move to the next generation, as anyone within 3 or 4 generations of the previous ruler could succeed to a lordship, a group called the Derbfín. A lord could be succeeded by his brother or cousin. Usually, the claimant with the strongest military support would succeed. This gave the Gaelic system great dynamism. While it had the advantage of weeding out weaker rulers, it also led to continual conflict within ruling families, which in turn stimulated the emergence of new septs. In Iveragh, there seem to be at least 11 McCarthy septs in addition to the McCarthy Moors. This does not include any of the Cork McCarthy septs. At certain times, underlords could play a role in deciding succession. O'Sullivan Moore's refusal to give the white rod of lordship to Donald McCarthy Moore's illegitimate son, also called Donald, prevented Hugh O'Neill from having the latter made McCarthy Moore in 1599. Instead, O'Neill had to agree to Florence McCarthy Ray becoming McCarthy Moore. As we'll see in the next episode, this move by O'Sullivan Moore, basically his only action of importance in the war, would have fatal consequences. It is also important to note that Gaelic lords, even provincial ones, did not own all the land they ruled over. Most was held by various underlords. Other parts belonged to their own sept or family. Most positions, such as O'Neill or McCarthy Moore, would have mensal lands, meaning that whoever held a position used these lands. At times, sept land could be redivided. However, this was not very common. Especially under the Tudors, the English had been trying to get the Gaelic Irish to accept English law. While English succession law appealed to many lords, landlord was less appealing, as Gaelic law was based on possession. If you held it, it was yours. The idea of someone such as Carew appearing and claiming land that had belonged to his family many centuries before was utterly alien to the Gaelic Irish, as the Carew family had abandoned their lands and thus forfeited them. However, under Elizabeth and James, English claimants to land held by the Gaelic Irish for hundreds of years caused considerable political unrest. It is also worth noting that, contrary to what many believe, Gaelic Ireland was not divided into clans. This may sound controversial. As we know it now, the concept of clan emerged during the Romantic period, well after the destruction of Gaelic Ireland. Although the word is originally Irish and was one of various words to describe a family group or a political group, it is now too intertwined with erroneous ideas to be of use in explaining Gaelic Ireland. It conveys the idea of something archaic and old-fashioned, something to be contrasted with modern political forms. Indeed, in Scotland, the word clan is used for family groups all over the country, including areas far from the Gaelic part of Scotland. Gaelic Ireland was not divided into clans. Rather, it was a sophisticated political and cultural system divided into a multitude of lordships. These were flexible in size, and their borders were dynamic, to say the least. They were governed by Gaelic or Old English elites consisting of powerful family groups. These were constantly dividing and often subject to internal conflict. This can clearly be seen in the rise of both Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell to power. For details of this, I would highly recommend Hiram Morgan's Tyrone Rebellion, which details the many O'Neill and O'Donnell septs. As mentioned, in the Lordship of Desmond there were at least 12 McCarthy septs, and if we add in Cork there are many, many more. None of these were clans. These lords did not command a group of people who were related to them. Rather, they were an elite governing a wide range of people. They were lords, fidalgos or hidalgos in the Portuguese-Spanish sense, nobles who were separate from the rest of the population. Lordships were sophisticated political organizations. Under the lord would have been various other elite families. For example, Ballycarby Castle was traditionally held by the O'Connells on behalf of McCarthy More. O'Sullivan More was the chief underlord or iveragh of McCarthy More. He had the right to confer the white rod of lordship on McCarthy More. Other important positions were being the marshal, responsible for organising military forces, the Lord's secretary, his steward, the tutor to his children, judges, as well as servants, etc. Church positions were important and often held by particular families. For example, the prior of Ballinaskellig Abbey came to be dominated by the O'Mulcroney family. Below all these were the peasants and skilled workers, smiths, weavers, etc. The idea that everyone in Ireland was a member of a clan is simply a romantic dream and dramatically oversimplifies Gaelic life. Gaelic Ireland may have been poor, but it was a sophisticated political system. It was dominated by family groups. But so were all European states and regions. Why were the O'Neills or McCarthys a clan, but not the Butlers, the Fitzgeralds, or indeed the Tudors or the Percys? It is worth dwelling a little on the Desmond or Clancarty survey. Donald McCarthy More died towards the end of 1596. He had no legitimate male heir, as his legitimate son had died some years previously. According to one interpretation, his being made Earl Clancarty meant that in the absence of a male heir, his land, the Lordship of Desmond, would revert to the crown and could be used for plantation. Other interpretations argue that it would go to the husband of his daughter Ellen, his only living heir. McCarthy More had made an agreement with a newcomer, Valentine Brown, that Ellen McCarthy would marry his son Nicholas in return for a loan. However, Florence McCarthy Ray pulled a fast one and married Ellen instead, thereby claiming to be heir to the McCarthy More Lordship and also to the McCarthy Ray one. He was imprisoned for several years because of this. The application of English law to the Gaelic Irish was often selective. No Gaelic lord could be permitted to hold these two lordships. They were too important. The size and strategic importance of the McCarthy More Lordship meant that the English undertook a detailed survey of his lands after his death. Fortunately, this survey has survived. It can be found on UCC's wonderful Celt site, which has a very good historical introduction. In addition to detailing landholds in Desmond at a micro level, it also details the services and tributes owed to McCarthy More. These included Garum Slua, the rising out of troops, Sorhain, or maintenance, payment in kind, Cuidiha, putting up and feeding the Lord for a night, Daugolo, which is possibly Dove Gowl or Black Charge, and also Conviog, a tax that went to the wife of the Lord. As an example of these charges, Slug Cormac paid for the townlands of Cool and Fayman and Valentia a total of £3, 9 shillings and 1 white groat a year. This included £3 for Dugolo and 6 shillings for Conviog. This would probably have been paid in kind rather than in money. Finally, it needs to be understood that the 9 Years' War was not the last gasp of a doomed culture. Nor was it predefined that England would win. Gaelic Ireland may have been poor and underdeveloped, but it was not frozen in time. Too often, Gaelic Ireland is regarded by many as the last remnants of some sort of ancient culture going back to classical times, to Vercingetorix or before, and that somehow the soldiers of O'Neill fought the same way as the Celts of Gaul. In other words, Gaelic warfare was based on shock and uncontrolled mass charges. This is rubbish. There was no Gaelic or Celtic way of war. War in Ireland in 1600 was not the same as in 1200 or 800 or even 100 BC when Vercingetorix fought Caesar. Like all societies, Gaelic Ireland was evolving, developing, changing. It may have been poor and underdeveloped, but Gaelic society was in touch with developments in Europe, whether in religion such as the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, politics, culture, technology, or military questions. The English were contemptuous of Gaelic Ireland, with many Elizabethans advocating horrific ways to civilise the Irish, which often verged on the genocidal. This included Elizabeth herself, who was not particularly disturbed by the huge numbers of Gaelic Irish slaughtered in Ireland. In general, the English failed to understand Gaelic Ireland. However, they should have, as the Gaelic Irish were not some mysterious tribe. They had been in contact with the English since before England existed. This misunderstanding has been echoed in the historiography until relatively recently. Somewhat ironically, while academic history has begun to incorporate a better understanding of Gaelic Ireland, in Ireland itself the popular understanding is deeply flawed, too often based on a romanticised view, one that is remarkably innocent in terms of the sources, failing to interpret or decipher them contextually. Worse, it also tends to freeze Gaelic Ireland, placing an ideal archaic society in the place of a modern society that was constantly changing. The 9 Years' War was the result of the dynamic and modernising nature of Gaelic Ireland. It was a war fought between unequal opponents. On the one hand, one of the Central European nations, a rich and centralised state, and on the other, a provincial lord, who, although he was rich, governed a relatively poor agricultural area. Yet, the Gaelic forces, outnumbered and out-resourced, came very close to winning the war. Indeed, if it had not been for Don Juan de Aquila's insistence that the forces of O'Neill and O'Donnell take offensive action at Kinsale when none was needed, they would have won. In Ulster, Hugh O'Neill formed a modern army based on the calibre musket and pike, on skirmishing, combined armed tactics, and the superior mobility of his army. His forces were divided into companies, trained and paid. They were no longer Galglass and Kern, but trained Gaelic soldiers. The English, however, would still use the word Kern, and especially wood Kern, as a term of contempt. Under O'Neill, Gaelic warfare was not based on shock. There was no Highland charge. Rather, the opposite tended to happen. O'Neill controlled where he fought and often refused to give battle. His men would often retreat before English attacks, using their superior mobility to escape or to attack the English elsewhere. On the other hand, the Gaelic cavalry was very weak. O'Neill failed to reform them. Using small horses and lacking stirrups, they were unable to charge home. Rather, they were used for harassment and scouting. In addition, Gaelic forces used the landscape to their advantage, building entrenchments or fortification, using forests, bogs and rivers to anchor their flanks, and plashing forests, in other words making them impenetrable by using natural materials to tie trees together and creating natural fortifications. The force that O'Neill built and which was copied elsewhere in Ireland was a match for Elizabeth's best generals and soldiers. They would inflict far more defeats on her than the Spanish. Initially, the war was fought in Ulster, then it spread into Leinster and Connacht. It was increasingly gaining a national aspect. However, O'Neill's confederacy failed to make inroads in Munster for a number of reasons. First, the Earl of Ormond was actively on the Crown's side. He was Protestant, distantly related to the Queen, and fought valiantly for her. Following the downfall of the Earl of Desmond, he was the dominant lord in Munster. The Earl of Thomond had a similar role in Clare, but was of less importance in the rest of Munster. Second, the absence of any Earl of Desmond and the sickness and then death of Donald McCarthy More left a significant political vacuum. The two most powerful lords in southern Munster were missing. Third, a large part of Munster was still recovering from the Desmond Rebellion. Thousands had been killed or starved to death. Many areas had been plundered or burned. Finally, a large number of English were living in the province. Supposedly, these were able to defend themselves. In the autumn of 1598, the picture would change dramatically. In August, the English army under Marshal Nicholas Bagnall was destroyed by Hugh O'Neill in the Battle of the Yellow Ford. This victory transformed the war. Bagnall was killed and his army destroyed. O'Neill's forces ran wild. The English were no longer putting down a rebellion. They were fighting a war, a national war that soon would become part of the international war between England and the Dutch on the one hand and the Spanish on the other. Worse, due to Elizabeth's indecision and faction fighting in her council, there had been no Lord Deputy since the death of Lord Burr in October 1597. Ormond was the senior English commander. However, he went first to defend his own lands. Shortly after the Yellow Ford, O'Neill sent a raiding party into Munster. This was led by Captain Richard Tyrone from an old English March family and one of O'Neill's best commanders, along with Eoin O'More and Con MacIntyre, O'Neill's illegitimate son. This raiding party, a few hundred men at most, with little cavalry, would collapse the Munster plantation. At news of their coming, the settlers fled en masse. English rule collapsed overnight in large parts of Cork, Kerry and Limerick. The 9 Years' War had come to Munster and to Kerry. Thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this first part. There will be 2 more parts over the coming weeks. Please subscribe if you can, and if you could support the channel, my Buy Me a Coffee account is below. I also have YouTube thanks. Gurav Mahagriv.